The worst part wasn't sitting alone at my cousin's engagement party. It was that nobody noticed. 300 people packed into the Fairmont Royal York's grand ballroom, champagne, flutes catching the light from chandeliers that probably cost more than my annual salary. And I was tucked into a corner near the emergency exit, using the wall to hold me up because my heels were killing me, and I hadn't eaten since the banana I'd grabbed on the GO train that morning. My cousin Petra had been my best friend growing up. We'd shared a bedroom for 2 summers when her parents were going through their divorce. We'd stayed up until 3 in the morning, talking about the kinds of things you only talk about when you're 16. And you think everything matters, and nothing is permanent. Now she was on the other side of the room accepting congratulations from people whose names I didn't know, and she hadn't looked in my direction once since the cocktail hour began. I kept telling myself it was fine. She was the guest of honor. She was busy. That's what you tell yourself when you fly home from Vancouver on a Friday night. Drag your suitcase to your aunt's spare room, and then stand alone near a fire exit for 40 minutes while everyone else seems to know exactly who they belong to. I was on my 3rd glass of the Niagara Riesling. Not because I was drinking fast, but because I'd been there long enough for the servers to loop past me 3 times. When I became aware of someone standing just to my left. Not close enough to be intrusive, just present. I didn't look right away. I'd been doing that thing where you stare at your phone to look occupied, scrolling through nothing, and I needed another second before I could summon the energy to acknowledge another relative. I barely recognized asking me what I was doing these days and whether I was that city. "You're doing the math," a voice said, low, even, not a question. I looked up. He was taller than I'd expected, though I didn't know what I'd expected. I hadn't been expecting anyone. Dark jacket, no tie, the top button of his shirt open like he'd made exactly one concession to the formality of the evening and decided that was enough. He was looking out at the room, not at me, which somehow made it easier to look at him. "I'm sorry?" "The math," he said again. "How many people in the room you actually know versus how many you're obligated to pretend you know. I've been watching you do it for about 10 minutes. I should have been unsettled by that. I wasn't. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the fact that someone had actually seen me. "I know my cousin," I said, "and my aunt. And technically my uncle, though we haven't spoken since he made a comment about my job at Christmas dinner 4 years ago. So 3. 2.5. He turned then, and I got my first real look at his face. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. The kind of features that didn't ask for attention, but held it anyway. There was a quality to his stillness that felt deliberate, like someone who'd learned a long time ago to be careful about how much he revealed. "Felix Arnault," he said. He didn't extend a hand, just offered the name like it was something I could take or leave. "I know who you are," I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me then. Really looked. Of course I knew who he was. Everyone in Toronto's development and infrastructure circles knew who Felix Arnault was. He'd built the Arnault Group, from his father's mid-size construction firm, into one of the largest private infrastructure developers in the country. There'd been a profile in the Globe last spring. I'd read it in the waiting room at my dentist's office. The kind of article that tells you everything about what a man has accomplished, and almost nothing about who he actually is. He had projects from Halifax to Calgary. He sat on the board of 3 hospitals. He was, according to the article, famously private. He was also, apparently, at my cousin Petra's engagement party, which made no sense to me at all. "How do you know Petra?" I asked, because it seemed like the only relevant question. "I don't," he said. "I know her fiancé's father. We have a meeting Monday morning, and Malcolm thought it would be efficient to do some preliminary conversation tonight." He paused. "I've been here for an hour and 15 minutes, and I've had exactly 3 minutes of useful conversation." "And the other 72 minutes?" "Champagne and geometry," he said, which made me laugh before I'd decided to. He looked at me when I laughed. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I'm Vivienne," I said, and then immediately thought, no, that's not right. Vivienne was in the file. "Sorry, long week. I caught myself." "People call me V, he repeated, like he was deciding whether to accept that. "What's the meeting about?" I asked, mostly to redirect. "Monday, with Malcolm's father, waterfront development." There's a mixed-use proposal for the port lands that's been moving through the city approval process and hitting some friction. My team is trying to understand which friction is political and which is structural. He said it the way someone talks about work when they've forgotten to perform being interesting, just the clean, direct version of what they actually think about. I found it unexpectedly compelling. You said you know who I am. What do you do? Environmental compliance. I consult for development projects that need sign-off from provincial ministries. I'm based in Vancouver now, but I did most of my early work here, so I still have clients in Ontario. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was actually processing what I'd said, not just waiting for his turn to talk. The Port Lands project, he said. Is that the kind of thing you consult on? Potentially, depending on what the friction is. I tilted my head. Is this how you do the 3 minutes of useful conversation? You find the one person in a room full of strangers who might actually be relevant, and you corner them near the exit. I didn't corner you, he said. You were already here. That's technically true. And I didn't know what you did when I came over. So why did you come over? He was quiet again. Longer this time. You looked like the only person in this room who was being honest, he said finally. Everyone else is performing something. You were just tired. I didn't know what to say to that. It was the most accurate description of how I'd felt all evening, said by someone I'd known for 4 minutes. Before I could respond, a woman materialized at his elbow. One of the event staff, her expression carrying the particular stress of someone managing 17 things simultaneously. She murmured something to him about a call from his assistant, something time-sensitive. He looked at me. I need to take this. 5 minutes. You don't have to come back, I said. I'm fine. I know you are, he said. I'm coming back because I want to. He was gone before I could figure out what to do with that. I stood there for a moment, just holding my wine glass, trying to remember the last time someone had said something to me that I actually needed to sit with for a second. It had been a while. He came back in 4 minutes. I'd counted, which I wasn't proud of. The call? I asked. Handled. He rejoined me like he'd never left. Like this spot near the fire exit was a place we'd agreed to meet. Tell me about the friction. I don't know enough about the specific project yet. Hypothetically, in your experience, when a mixed-use waterfront proposal stalls in Toronto's approval process, where does it usually catch? And then we were just talking. Really talking. The way I'd almost forgotten was possible at a party like this. The way where you stop being aware of the room around you because the conversation itself becomes the room. He asked good questions. The kind that made it clear he'd actually listened to your last answer before asking the next one. I told him about a project I'd worked on in Richmond. How the environmental impact assessment had flagged contamination from an industrial site that the developer had known about and hoped would stay buried. And how that had unraveled everything. He told me about a project in Hamilton where the community consultation process had been genuine, not performative, and how that had changed the shape of the final proposal in ways that actually made it better. Petra found me at some point, floated over in her dress, her fiancé Malcolm behind her, looking flushed and pleased with everything. She hugged me and said she was so glad I'd come and introduced me to Malcolm, who shook my hand warmly. And then she noticed Felix standing beside me, and something flickered across her face. Mr. Arnaud, she said, shifting into a register I recognized as her professional voice. I didn't realize you'd met my cousin. Petra, he said. Congratulations. Your venue team did something remarkable with the lighting. She thanked him, and they exchanged about 90 seconds of polite conversation. And then she and Malcolm drifted back toward the center of things. Before she went, she caught my eye and raised her eyebrows in a way that managed to contain an entire paragraph. I ignored it. Your cousin seems like someone who notices things, Felix said when they were gone. She's very good at reading rooms, I agreed. She's been doing it since we were kids. It's how she survived our family. How did you survive your family? By leaving, I said. I moved to Vancouver 6 years ago. I tell myself it was for work. Was it? I thought about it honestly. 60% work, I said. 40% needing to be somewhere nobody had a version of me they were attached to. He looked at me. That's one of the more precise self-estimates I've heard. Environmental compliance, I said. Everything gets measured. He almost smiled again. I was starting to be able to read the almost smiles, which felt like learning a new language in real time. The party shifted around us. Speeches starting, people finding their dinner tables, the energy changing texture the way it does when an event transitions from cocktails to program. I realized I didn't know where I was sitting, and I suddenly didn't care. I should find my table, I said, not making any move to go. Your name card will still be there in 10 minutes, he said. He wasn't making any move either. What made you choose environmental compliance? Specifically, I studied environmental science at UBC, I said. I wanted to work in conservation. I did for a couple of years. And then I got very tired of caring about things that didn't change and started caring about making projects that were going to happen anyway happen less badly. I paused. That sounds bleak. It sounds pragmatic. Maybe they're the same thing. I don't think they are, he said. Pragmatism is what you do with what you actually have. Bleakness is a refusal to see what you have. I looked at him. That's from something. Probably, he said. I read too much. What do you read? Currently? A biography of Robert Moses that is making me rethink every infrastructure project I've ever been involved in. He looked at me. You know who Moses is? Builder of the Cross Bronx Expressway and destroyer of the South Bronx, I said. The man who put overpasses too low for buses on purpose so that Black and Puerto Rican families couldn't reach Jones Beach. Yes, I know who Moses is. We talked about him extensively in my planning and equity seminar at UBC. Something genuine moved through his expression then. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition. The Port Lands project, he said. I'd like to send you the proposal before Monday. Not as a business overture. Just, I'd like to know what you see that we might have missed. I'm flying back to Vancouver Sunday night. Before you fly. I looked at him for a moment. The room had settled into dinner around us. We were two people standing near an exit at a party we'd both felt vaguely out of place at, and somehow in the last hour and a half we'd had a more honest conversation than I'd managed with most people in recent memory. Okay, I said. He nodded, took out his phone, and I gave him my email, which felt oddly formal given everything we'd just talked about. I did find my table eventually. It was between my aunt's friend from her book club and a colleague of Malcolm's who worked in finance and wanted to talk about property values in Leslieville. I smiled and answered, and ate the cedar plank salmon and thought, intermittently, about the way Felix Arnaud had said I'm coming back because I want to, like it was the most straightforward thing in the world. The proposal arrived at 11:17 that night. I was still awake, sitting on the edge of the bed in my aunt's spare room, my heels finally off. The city doing its quiet late-night thing outside the window. I opened it. I read for 2 hours. There were things in it that were very good. The community engagement framework was more thorough than I usually saw. The phase development timeline was realistic in a way that suggested someone on the team had actually looked at comparable projects and their failure modes. But there were two things that troubled me. One about a proposed remediation approach on the eastern parcel that I thought significantly underestimated the complexity of the soil conditions, and one about the public transit integration plan that assumed a city council commitment that I was fairly sure didn't actually exist yet. I wrote him a memo. Not a polished, professional document. Just my notes, organized by concern, with the specific questions I thought needed answers before Monday. It was almost 1 a.m. by the time I sent it. His reply came at 1:47. This is exactly what I was afraid of and exactly what I needed. The transit integrations assumption is from our city contact, and I have now realized I need to verify it independently before this meeting. The remediation underestimate is something my environmental lead flagged internally and was overruled. Can I ask you something? I typed back, yes. Would you be willing to be on this project? Formally. As the environmental compliance consultant, I know you're based in Vancouver. I know you said the trip was partly about leaving, but I'm asking anyway. I stared at that for a while. I'd need to know more, I wrote back. About the scope, the timeline, the team dynamics. And I'd need the conversation with your environmental lead before I agreed to anything. I want to understand what happened when they flagged the remediation issue. That's fair, he wrote. Can I call you tomorrow? I have brunch with my aunt at 10. After brunch, I put my phone down and looked at the ceiling of my aunt's spare room, at the familiar water stain in the corner that had been there since I was 8 years old, and I thought about how I'd gotten on a plane on Friday with the specific emotional preparation for a party where I'd feel invisible, and how something had gone sideways with that plan in the best possible way. After brunch, I typed and put the phone on the nightstand. He called at 12:43. I was sitting on a bench in Trinity Bellwoods Park because after brunch, my aunt had looked at me with her specific maternal radar and told me I seemed like someone who needed to be outside. I talked to my environmental lead this morning, he said, without preamble. Her name is Tamsin. She told me the full version of what happened with the remediation assessment. She was right to flag it, and I owe her a direct conversation about how it was handled. What will you do with it? Bring in a second assessment before we move forward, even if it delays the timeline. He paused. I don't want to build things that fail, he said, and I heard something in it that I understood wasn't just about the project. I've seen what happens to communities that live with the consequences of projects done badly. I don't want to be part of that. That's why you're reading about Moses. That's exactly why. I watched a dog chase a squirrel up an oak tree with complete ineffective commitment. Tell me about the team, I said. He told me, clearly, without spin. He told me who was strong and who he had concerns about. He told me the political pressure points and where they were coming from. He told me what success actually looked like on this project versus what the press release version would say. It was, again, the most direct professional conversation I'd had in years. Why me? I asked when he'd finished. There are environmental compliance consultants in Toronto. You wouldn't have to reconfigure anything if you hired locally up. Because you read a proposal at 11 o'clock at night and sent me a memo that was more useful than anything my team produced in 6 months of internal review, he said. And because you told me you do your best work when nobody has a version of you they're attached to. I have no version of you. I would just be getting the actual you. I was quiet for a moment. The soil contamination on the eastern parcel, I said. The secondary assessment. I want to be in the room when it happens. Not just reviewing the report after. I want to be there. Done. And I want a direct line to the community liaison team. Not filtered through project management. Also done. And if I flag something and I'm overruled the way Tamsin was. You won't be, he said. But if you feel like you're heading in that direction, you call me directly. Not my assistant. Me. I looked up at the park around me. The trees were just beginning to come into their late spring fullness, that particular shade of Toronto May green that I'd forgotten I missed until I was standing in it. The city felt different than it had when I'd left, or maybe I was different in ways I hadn't fully accounted for. I'll need to rearrange some things in Vancouver, I said, and I'm not relocating. I'd need to work out a schedule. Whatever schedule works, he said. I've built entire infrastructure projects with teams in different time zones. One consultant between Toronto and Vancouver is not going to be the logistical challenge. Okay, I said. A pause. Okay, he said. Yes, I'll do it. I heard something in the silence that followed, not relief exactly, but its quieter cousin. Thank you, he said. For the memo, for the call, for the honesty. You asked for honest, I said. I tend to just be it. I know, he said. That's why I came to stand near the exit. I laughed. He didn't, but I could feel him almost smiling through the phone, and by now I knew what that meant. I flew back to Vancouver Sunday night as planned. The city opened up below me as the plane lifted off. The lake, the sprawl, the tiny illuminated grid of streets that had been the context of the first 20-some years of my life before I'd needed something else. I pressed my face toward the window for a moment like I was 12, watching it get smaller. My phone had a message from Petra. Okay, who was that, and you have to tell me everything. Followed, 12 minutes later, by, also, I'm really glad you came. I know I was bad at showing it tonight. I'm sorry. I miss you. I wrote back. I miss you too. I'll explain everything soon. Also, I might be in Toronto more. Her reply was immediate. The work started 2 weeks later. I flew into Pearson on a Tuesday morning, took the Union Pearson Express downtown like I was a commuter, and walked into the Arnaud Group's offices in the Exchange Tower with my laptop bag, and my specific anxieties about being the outside voice that nobody has to listen to. Tamsin was the first person I met. She was about 40, precise, in the way of someone who had learned that precision was armor, and she looked at me with careful assessment when Felix introduced us. "He told me what you found in the proposal," she said. "You called it the same way I called it." "I read your flagged notes in the internal documents he forwarded," I said. "You were right the first time." She looked at me. Something settled in her expression. "Okay," she said. "Let's talk about the eastern parcel." The next 6 weeks were the most engaged I'd been at work in longer than I wanted to admit. The secondary contamination assessment confirmed everything Tamsin and I had both suspected. There was legacy industrial contamination from a facility that had been decommissioned in the early 90s, and the remediation would be slower and more expensive than the original plan had accounted for. I sat in the room when we delivered that news to the project's financial backers. It wasn't a comfortable meeting. Felix didn't minimize it or deflect. He laid it out clearly, explained what the revised approach would require, and made the case for why proceeding carefully was actually better for the long-term return on the project than cutting corners would be. 2 of the investors pushed back hard. One of them said things that made me genuinely angry, the particular kind of anger I recognized from years of sitting in rooms where someone with financial exposure started treating environmental standards as negotiable obstacles. Felix let him finish. Then he said quietly, "The remediation timeline isn't a preference. It's provincial law. And even if it weren't, we're not building on contaminated land and then letting the community deal with it." The investor looked at him for a moment and then backed down, which I suspected wasn't something that happened to him often. After the meeting in the hallway, I said, "That was the right call. It was the only call," he said. He looked tired in a way he usually kept out of his face. "There's a neighborhood that's going to exist on that land for 100 years. The people who live there don't get to not live there when it gets complicated." I thought about that for most of the ride back to my hotel. About the difference between knowing something is true and actually letting it govern how you make decisions when it costs you something. I'd worked with a lot of developers. I hadn't met many who had actually internalized that gap. He asked me to dinner that Friday. "Just dinner," he said. "Not a working dinner, though he said it like he understood. Those might be the same thing for me, and he was fine either way. We went to a restaurant in Kensington Market, small and unpretentious, the kind of place that didn't need to announce itself. We talked about the project for about 10 minutes, and then somehow moved through it into other things. His father, who had built the original company and died before seeing what it became. My mother, who had wanted me to be a pharmacist, and had spent several years not quite forgiving me for being something else instead. The particular texture of Toronto winters, and whether they built character or just resentment. A book I was reading about urban ecology that I'd been meaning to tell him about since I'd started it. At some point, I became aware that we'd been there for 3 hours. He walked me back toward my hotel because it was a nice night, and we were both still talking. On the corner of Queen and Spadina, he stopped, and I stopped with him, and we stood there for a moment in the way you stand with someone when neither of you is quite ready for the conversation to end. "I'm glad you were standing near the exit," he said. "You came to stand near the exit," I pointed out. "I did," he said, not apologetically, just as a fact he was willing to own. I looked at him in the streetlight. The particular way his face had learned to hold things, the quality of attention he brought to everything that included me. I thought about how I'd gotten on a plane to my cousin's engagement party, feeling like the least connected person in any room I entered, and how something had changed in the specific way that things change when you stop bracing for what isn't there and notice what actually is. "There's going to be another investor meeting in 3 weeks," I said. "I want to be in it." "You're already in it," he said. "I put you on the list the same day you sent the memo." I looked at him. "You were going to say yes," he said, with the quiet certainty of someone who pays attention. "I wasn't sure I was going to say yes," I said. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to be ready in case you did." We said goodnight. I walked the rest of the way to my hotel alone, the city loud and warm around me, on a Friday night. And I thought about readiness, about what it means to leave room for something you can't quite name yet, to keep a place open on the list before you know for certain it'll be filled. I called Petra from the hotel room. she answered on the second ring. So, she said. So, I agreed. You're staying in Toronto longer. I'm not staying, I said. I'm coming back. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Is that about the project? I thought about a corner in Kensington Market, a man who reads about Robert Moses because he wants to build things that last, and the specific quality of a conversation that doesn't need the room around it to make sense. Partly, I said. She made a sound that contained everything she'd decided not to say, which was the most Petra thing she'd ever done. I'm glad you came to the party, she said. I almost didn't, I said. I know. I could tell when you walked in. She paused. You looked like someone who was just waiting to leave. I was, I said. And then I didn't. The city was still going outside my window. A streetcar moving down Queen, someone laughing on the sidewalk below, the sound of Toronto at midnight being entirely itself, neither asking for my attention nor refusing it. I'd forgotten how much I'd missed it until I was back inside it. The way you forget a feeling until the specific conditions return that let you feel it again. I had a flight home booked for Sunday. I looked at it on my phone, and then I looked at the Toronto skyline, and I thought, there will be another Sunday. There will be another flight and another project meeting and another corner where someone stands waiting because he'd decided to leave room in case. I left the flight as it was. Some things you don't have to change all at once to know they're already different.